Picture this. It's 2007. You've just been to a screening of The Golden Compass starring Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig. It doesn't leave the biggest of impressions, but you thought the fight between the two bears was cool. You wander into your local Woolworths and stumble across a PS2 game with the exact same poster and title. Oh cool, I didn't know they made a game of this. I wonder if I can play as the bear. So you use your leftover pocket money to give it a go because it's 2007 and Freddos are still under 20p. You go home and boot up your PS2, shit your pants because of how terrifying the startup sound is, change your pants, and hit the start button. Wow, it looks just like the movie. This was the age of movie tie-in games. A simpler time when we couldn't harass developers on social media and when the average development cycle was significantly shorter unless you were Duke Nukem. An age when a film would come out in theaters and a game would come out within the same year across multiple platforms and most of the time produced by multiple studios. Looking at the state of video games now in contrast to the film and TV industry, this trend appears to be happening in reverse. Instead of Barbie for the PS5, we get Fallout the TV show. And with the success of video game adaptations such as this and The Last of Us, I'd imagine a lot more of these adaptations to come in the future. This should come as no surprise, because even with the large amount of work needed in post-production, the average AAA game will take triple the amount of time, if not more. And then it will be quadruple A. We all know this is due to our expectations skyrocketing to unrealistic proportions, as every game now has to have an open world, ray tracing, upgrade system, and highly detailed animation of a woman twerking. A recent yet loose example of this would be Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which according to IGN was set to be released in the same year as The Way of Water, only for it to be delayed by a year and turn out to be just as mid as the movie. But this wasn't always the case, and I find it quite sad to see that this is something that is no longer possible by today's standards. So I've decided to do what every normal person would do in this scenario. Write a video essay.
You're joking. Not another one?
I started working on this project because I wanted to explore a number of things. How could you adapt a movie into a game? How could its plot and settings be developed into an interactive medium? And how could some of these elements be translated into interesting game mechanics? But before I get ahead of myself, I just wanted to ramble about some of the games that I grew up with, as a lot of the great games that made up a lot of people's childhoods in the 2000s were either not on the PS2 or way too edgy to sneak into my mother's shopping trolley. So I'm going to attempt to look at these through mostly a comparative lens, drawing from my initial interactions with these games, some of which you would have heard of and others which have been lost with the sands of time. Starring Jake Gyllenhaal. I will also look at the original films and hold them alongside their video game counterparts to see if they do a good job at adapting some of these iconic stories, as well as simply judging whether or not they are fun. And to save myself from getting into trouble, I will be using footage from long plays of these games from other YouTube channels, which I'll be crediting down here, or wherever this bit is. So slap those nostalgia goggles on and buckle up, because I'm about to ramble like I've forgotten to take my meds this morning. Part 1. Sci-fi and fantasy. So let's start with the aforementioned Golden Compass game. Adapted from the movie of the same name, adapted from the book named after the Aurora Borealis. The movie was directed by Chris Weitz, who was known at the time for directing About a Boy and American Pie. So the perfect choice for a fantasy film. The game was developed by Shiny Entertainment, who was mainly known for their fairly successful Earthworm Jim series. And I only say fairly successful because they were dissolved a month before this game came out. Set in an alternate universe where Christianity has an alarming amount of power and everyone's demons exist as cute animal sidekicks, the story centers around a young woman named Lyra and her demon Pan, who after stopping their uncle from being poisoned embark on a journey to discover other worlds outside of their own. So the game starts exactly where you'd expect it to. At the end. This brings me to one of the first things that I noticed when writing this video. A lot of these games very loosely follow the plots of the films, sometimes not at all. I guess the first thing to keep in mind when it comes to these adaptations is how well does it translate into gameplay. So it makes sense that the developers would want to hook people in with some action rather than exposition. Except, this is the only action that you're getting for the next 2 hours. The bear doesn't show up again until halfway through the game. Either way, it doesn't translate extremely well into the gameplay. Like with a lot of games now, this game tries to do a lot of things, but not very well. You have the combat system, quick time events, climbing mechanics, puzzles, and even a lying to your uncle simulator. It's not weed, sir, I promise! So already off to a great start. An average game for an average movie. I didn't even finish this one, I got as far as the boat section and then gave up. But still, there are some features in this game which I personally feel are creative ways of adapting certain plot elements from the film. Heck, even his dark source material.
Get it?
My favourite example that springs to mind is Pan's shapeshifting ability, where each of the 4 forms he transforms into serves a different purpose to help you on your journey. The ermine allows you to scan your surroundings for secrets and relevant information. The eagle allows you to glide across large gaps. The wildcat allows you to climb up walls. And the sloth spins like this. Wow, just like real sloths. Speaking of transforming, I think at this point we all know what the plot of Transformers is, even if Michael Bay forgot what it was halfway through making them. It's good robots versus bad robots, and they turn into vehicles. Now, call me biased, but I love these games. And before I got my sweaty palms on a PS2, I had a DS. And when the first game came out, I had a copy of the Autobots version of this game that was released alongside the opposing Decepticons, and was developed by Vicarious Visions, who'd later go on to become Blizzard Albany. Both games play roughly the same, the only differences being some slight variations in the plot, and different locations that you get to roam around in. And despite it not being as visually impressive, this game has a feature which blows my mind that it wasn't used in any future Transformers games. In the first film, we see the robots in disguise landing on Earth for the first time, right, Michael? Where they appear as just your regular giant robot. Nothing to see here, good citizen. It's then we get several examples of these characters scanning the first thing they see and transforming into them. A cool introduction to how these beings function within our world and how they get around without being detected. You know, the robots in disguise part. Now this premise is barely revisited in any of the following films. Most of the new character designs happen off screen, and for a film series that makes perfect sense. We don't need to see it again. However, playing with this concept in a video game. In both Autobots and Decepticons, you play as a rookie for the warring factions and start the game off in this stripped-down form. It's here the game introduces the mechanic of scanning vehicles you find in the game and can transform into any of them outside of missions. Each vehicle has different statistics and playstyles from one another. Some cars are fast, some are slow, and some are helicopters, so going into missions has a certain level of freedom. Conceptually, making this minor plot detail a fully developed game mechanic is really cool. You can also play as some of the major characters from the film on certain missions, and there's even a multiplayer mode where you can play against your mates. Yet there are some shortcomings in these versions of the game that are made incredibly apparent when compared to the others. Something that you see a lot of in the Michael Bay films is the absurd amount of destruction left by the Transformers. The mortality rate in this universe must be wild.
Disgusting.
And while the DS game allows you to pick up lampposts and other cars to use as weapons, the level of destruction cannot really compete with the other versions. They were developed by Traveller's Tales, the Lego people, but way before they became Lego, they did a couple of pretty good tie-in games, including Toy Story 2, Buzz Lightyear, Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and both console and PC versions of this game. And in these versions, you can destroy buildings almost entirely as humans run away screaming, fire explosives that send you flying halfway across the map, and there are even bonuses given depending on your faction. Decepticons can get bonuses for the more destruction you cause, and Autobots can get points for drifting really good. Look at them go! The scale of the Transformers feels larger in these versions, and both factions feel more realized with the bonus system. On top of that, you can pick either faction from the main menu rather than having to buy another game, and you get some really fun missions for some of the main characters. One of my favorites is the one with Scorponok? Wow, they really went for it with that one. It even attempts to fit the missions into the film's narrative a little more than the DS version, by filling in the gaps from what we didn't see from Shia LaBeouf's perspective. Like, how did Bumblebee get into that car dealership? He was fighting Decepticons. Or, what happened when he fought Barricade? He was lobbing palm trees at him to stop him from having a seizure. They even put Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox in the game, which... yeah. Nevertheless, these games are a great example of adapting the chaotic action of the first Transformers film, and I would argue are a lot better than the film itself. Though this should come as no surprise because this is a Michael Bay movie after all. It is worth mentioning that this is something that's pretty common with action movies adapted into video games. The story will be the least developed in contrast to the action, a lot like the film genre itself. And it's not like people loved The Raid because of how good the story was. No, it was because it was written by a Welshman. So what other examples can we look at for action movies? Specifically ones with underdeveloped or worse, unintelligible plots. Ah yeah, Jumper, Griffin's Story. Remember Jumper? The 2008 movie starring Hayden Christensen and Billy Elliot? Remember that movie? The one adapted from the 1992 sci-fi novel by David S. Goyer, writer of... and Simon Kinberg, writer of... and Jim Yules, writer of... oh, that's actually really good. Where a boy discovers he can teleport, or as he calls it, jumps, and in his adulthood is hunted by Samuel L. Jackson and his horrifying hair. The game kind of follows the plot of the film, but is rather an adaptation of the book that came out 6 months beforehand. It goes from the perspective of its co-star, Griffin, and opens with this cool cinematic of his family being murdered to him eating a chocolate bar. Oh, and by the way, the writing in both the game and the movie, I would say, is of the same, caliber.
My name's Griffin, and if there's one thing I hate, it's people not minding their own business.
And then the gameplay starts, and it's I had the PS2 version of this game, so I can excuse the dated graphics a bit, but even looking at this footage from the Xbox 360, it somehow looks worse. I remember when getting this game, I thought it'd be really cool to teleport around and bonk people on the head and maybe even teleport cars. This is not what I had in mind. Weirdly enough, on the PS2 and Wii ports of this game, there's a feature which doesn't appear to be on the Xbox 360 version of this game, which I feel is worth mentioning, and I can imagine would be a lot better on the Wii with the benefit of hindsight. It's also worth noting that a completely different studio developed these versions of the game to the one on the 360. Put it simply, you hold down a button and this cute little cursor pops up, and when you release the button, you teleport where the cursor has landed. Simples. Except before the levels can get interesting enough for you to move around in, the game ends. Yep, this footage isn't a speedrun, this person is playing this game at a normal speed. Game's done quick, more like game. Done. There's another feature which is roughly the same on both versions, which I feel would have translated well if developed further. In the film, we get a lot of these over-the-top action sequences where the characters teleport around a series of dramatically different locations, sometimes placing some poor bastard in the worst place imaginable, and other times using a bus to fight Samuel L. Jackson. Arguably the only redeeming quality of the film, in my opinion, and this idea is introduced in the games via cutscenes. Of course you don't get to do these things because this is 2008 after all, but I do feel like the 360 versions does this a lot better by making these cutscenes so over the top. Like, imagine bonking a dude enough times that the game does this. Now let's talk about the sea. The sea has a wide range of possibilities for video games. They could be open ocean sandboxes, creepy fishing simulators, underwater horror, or even pirate action adventure. Personally, this type of setting is something I would love to talk about a lot more in another video, because there's only so much of the ocean that we have already explored, and the rest is still unknown. Especially with horror, there is just so much potential with the sea, because what else is out there that we haven't discovered yet? What else is in the deep, dark depths of the ocean that we don't even know exists? And that's really cool. And I'd love to see that explored in video games, TV, and even movies. So anyway, I'm going to talk about Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest.
Captain! Yeah? No!
Quick side note, I recorded this several months ago before I got a haircut, so apologies for that. This was another DS game I remember playing a lot of at the time, which I wasn't expecting to enjoy as much as I did. I only say this because the game looks like this.
Ugh. Brother, ugh. What's that?
Uncanny. It was developed by Amaze Entertainment, who did a bunch of DS ports of other movie tie-in games, and this one I'd say is a pretty good adaptation, if not a good game, which I'll get into more in a minute. In the sequel to the original film, Dead Man's Chest follows our protagonists Jack Sparrow, Will Turner, and Elizabeth Swann, who compete in a race to get to the heart of this Squid Man. Directed by Gore Verbinski, director of the first movie and this hidden gem, and also the third movie, which, And at the time, I was a particular fan of these films. And of course, Jack Sparrow. Maybe even Johnny Depp. But not so much now because of reasons. I was so obsessed with pirates for such a long time because of these movies. And having rewatched this particular movie recently, I can still understand why. There's still great CGI, amazing stunts, interesting world building, and memorable performances. Davy Jones will forever be an iconic villain, even if he isn't necessarily the best written. Look at this dude. Bill Nye goes hard in this role. No, not the science guy, I mean the dad from About Time. How does the game translate all of this? Well, in one of the first scenes of Dead Man's Chest, we get a scene of Mr. Gibbs doing pirate shit and is about to take a drink of wow, that's a lovely looking bottle, of rum. But before he can take a sip, he is interrupted by a horrifying noise, and we then go to some crows flying overhead who lead us to this prison, which looks awfully familiar. Wait, did this film inspire Dark Souls? We realise that Jack is in this prison, but instead of a cool scene of him breaking out of it, he's already done it and somehow escapes in a coffin. In the DS game, you get a full level of you breaking out, which I loved as a kid because I wished we spent more time in that location in the film. It's one thing that I'd hoped to see more of when writing this video, where video games expand on parts from the films they're adapting from that were otherwise unexplored. And luckily, there are a few other examples that do this pretty well, and others that are okay. Having said that, I think a lot of the levels in this game are pretty good and capture a lot of the memorable moments of the film, making them into pretty fun gaming sequences. A great example being the journey to Teodama's house, involving essentially an elevator level. The combat in this game isn't anything special, but for a DS game from 2006, it has some well-developed mechanics which play into Jack's somewhat improvised style of fighting a little, with things like throwable items and picking up your enemy's weapons, culminating in an ultimate which is essentially bringing a gun to a sword fight. It even swaps between Jack, Will, and Elizabeth in the game, and as Elizabeth you get to play her first level in this wedding dress, which must be so impractical. One thing that I find really funny now is that around the time I was playing this game initially, I was a stupid child who had no suspicions of them possibly having ADHD, and would sometimes just completely ignore entire game mechanics that were otherwise explained to me. So for a couple of weeks when I first started playing this game, I only used the item throwing mechanic and the kick, so the gameplay mostly just looked like this. I got an emulator just for this bit, which makes me realize I could be just using my own footage. There were a few trends in this era of video games, which I honestly wish they did more of now, but can understand why, because the economy, am I right? Where they bring back some of the original voice cast to reprise their roles, and you get these hilariously wooden performances from the likes of Tobey Maguire.
Maybe I'm not that amazing, but I have been spectacular on occasion.
But to be fair, he's a bit wooden in Spider-Man anyway.
See you, chump.
In other cases, you get a range of great to bizarre sound-alikes. One of my favourites being a combination of a good sound-alike, but with the energy of a character from Spyro.
No thanks. See ya!
I'm talking about the Harry Potter games.
Oh my god! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! What's the
Procedure, everyone. What's the procedure?
Stay calm! Everybody calm down!
Now, some might say it's a pretty hard time to be a Harry Potter fan, but I guess it can't be as bad as being a trans person. As someone who recently came out as non-binary, I find it incredibly depressing to think that something that made up a large part of my childhood directly benefits a woman that doesn't think that me or some of my friends and family should exist. And as much as I'd love to ramble on about that, there are already plenty of other great YouTube videos from other trans creators that cover this subject a lot better. But what I will say, if I can briefly summarize it, which I probably won't, these films are good because this woman was barely involved in making them, and then they got worse when she started actually writing them. According to Draco's actor Tom Felton, who could be saying more to defend the trans community, J.K. Rowling wasn't that involved with the creative process of a majority of the original franchise, and was only brought onto set a few times as a consultant. Whilst these are her ideas, they were executed better by other people. The writing in the books has always been bad, and we already have plenty of internet proof as to how she cannot use the word said more than once. I think it's a shame that a large group of people who worked on these projects out of love and passion for the source material are ignored by so many people because it's keeping a senile old bat's Twitter relevant. Does this mean I speak for all trans people? No. Does this mean that I endorse people watching Harry Potter? No. Does this mean that I want people to stop watching Harry Potter?
No.
I don't know, if I'm being perfectly honest, because much like a bitter ex, I still haven't moved on from this. I'd love to sit down and play the new Hogwarts Legacy game, but I honestly feel like if I did, I would be snapped out of existence. But anyway, here's Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets emulated on the GameCube because fuck J.K. Rowling. This was the one that I owned and played the most of, so this is the one that I'll talk about. And I got it during the blissful period of when Twitter didn't exist. God, imagine if J.R. Tolkien had Twitter. Oh god, I wonder what he'd have to say. Probably something bad. And like I mentioned in the introduction to this section, these games do not feature the original cast. And so you get Harry and Ron sounding like this.
You ready to do a bit of deniming then, Harry? Well, I'm not sure, Ron.
The plot of Harry Potter needs no explanation, because I want this part to be over as quickly as possible, and I've already spent way too much time talking about how a turd is in fact poo. Wizards, potions, spells, and flying rugby. Does this game translate this well?
Yeah.
Developed by Evil Adjacent Games and adapted from the book of the same name, my personal favourite in the series, mainly for Kenneth Branagh as Gilderoy Lockhart, who's definitely in my top 5 posh twats I want to lob a bottle at, and definitely isn't a stand-in for a writer who's a complete fraud. And this game, along with its sequels, are pretty great. They capture all of the iconic locations, spells, and key cinematic moments of the films pretty well, sometimes even playing around with different mechanics, which at this point is all I'm really asking for with these games. And I have a lot of fun memories of this game in particular. I liked exploring the Hogwarts grounds, whether it be on foot or on the Nimbus 2000, learning different spells by doing a dungeon crawl that's weirdly connected to your classroom, and talking to PS2 Hagrid.
Did I tell you, I've been having a bit of trouble lately with flesh-eating slugs?
Another thing that I remember when playing this as a kid was that I was terrified of the stealth sections in this game. Oh yeah, there are stealth sections in this game. Not necessarily because of the things you're hiding from, though prefects were kinda scary, but because it would play this music whenever you're seen. Come here! Absolutely terrifying. Besides the stealth sections, I'd imagine that Hogwarts Legacy still captures the spirit of these games and takes them a step further. But then again, it could have done with a lot less of its already very problematic themes. So in summary, good games from good movies written by a massive pile of dog shit. Now, it would be silly of me to not mention the movie subgenre that is pretty much the perfect fit for movie tie-in games. Part 2. I probably should have ended the video here, but I kept going. Superheroes. A person with extraordinary abilities that aren't humanly possible would translate into something very fun for players. But much like with the current state of the subgenre itself, there are considerably a lot fewer good quality games in contrast to the ones we've already seen. So I'm going to run through a few of these without much context because these aren't very successful franchises. Starting with Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 2 is an objectively perfect game of an objectively perfect movie, so I have nothing to say about it that hasn't already been said by many other people. Spider-Man 3, on the other hand, is kind of like the +1 your friend brings to a party. Whilst they are kind of funny, they're also really weird. In the third film, directed by Sam Raimi, our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is faced with fighting the guy that may have killed his uncle, a black goo monster from outer space, and a new rival at work, Eric Foreman, only to discover MJ has left him for his other new rival, James Franco. And needless to say, it's a mess, despite some of the cool action sequences, and the game kind of attempts to follow the plot of the film, except when it doesn't and it's Morbin time. It was released for the PS2, PS3, PSP, Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii, PC. Yes! And this version of the game was also developed by Vicarious Visions, whilst the others were developed by Treyarch and Beanox, now known as Call of Duty developers 2 and 3. Yeah, this game looks cursed on the 360, and I honestly preferred the PS2 port of this game, since a lot of the cool mechanics from Spider-Man 2 was just moved over to this one. Plus, it still has the feature of the symbiote suit, which is essentially the biggest selling point of the game in the first place. This game might not be as good as its predecessor, but I honestly find the symbiote suit gameplay to be a pretty good progression from the last one, and all in all makes for a good game mechanic. But that doesn't necessarily make it a good plot element for a film on top of all of the other things that you have in it. In the game, you get such a satisfying feeling of watching in real time from the click of a button, Spider-Man going from normal to edgy very quickly, and you have more power in your attacks and movement compared to when you don't have the suit on. as well as destroying the ground when you inevitably jump from the Empire State Building. There's even a mechanic that I completely forgot about, where if you wear the suit for too long, you die if you don't mash a button repeatedly. Do you work out? No, I mash. There's an added element of choosing the right time to put on the black suit, which I find a great way of exploring how corrupting it can be from wearing it for too long, as we've already seen in many other Spider-Man media and not just this film.
Get back here, Shocker! Shocker!
Much like with Hogwarts Legacy in the old Harry Potter games, I'm sure the new Spider-Man 2 builds on this concept a lot better than this, as it already has done with its web swinging, and at least I won't feel as bad giving money to these guys, I think. Wait, £700?! After a certain point, I eventually got an Xbox 360, despite there still being a few PS2 games released every now and then, and one of the first games I played a lot of was Wolverine. Though I shouldn't necessarily say a game I played a lot of, I just played the demo. Though I can't get into too much detail about this game, I still feel like it's worth talking about, as the demo still gives you a general idea of what kind of gameplay loop you're getting into, with the absence of a skill tree and other various features like different suits. So I'm still going to talk about this, since I've seen the movie it's adapting from, unfortunately, several times, and it's on the list, so why not? Adapted from the movie of the same name by Raven Software, another Call of Duty developer, RIP, and it's one of the few games which is far superior to the film that it's adapting from. But that's just because it focuses on the thing we've already talked about, the action, and not the god-awful writing. Who wrote this movie anyway? Oh. Well, I guess he kind of forgot about how to write a coherent story. And the movie barely does the action well either, like, what the f*** is Deadpool doing here? And what is Deadpool doing here?
I don't know if you're allowed to do that.
I played this demo repeatedly because it was just so good. Even though there are games that the combat takes heavy inspiration from, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. If it's fun and feels good to do, then why not do it again? And yet it still feels fresh and new rather than clearly copied and pasted. And chaining attacks are just so satisfying with Logan's meaty forehands, combined with the R-rated gore, which adds another layer to an already tasty burger. Keep in mind that this game came out before we had any R-rated representation of Wolverine, and now we have 2 films on top of that. But the mechanic which I would say is the highlight for me personally has got to be the lunge, which feels and looks so cool. I love how you can interrupt an enemy jumping at you with it, or use it to get to higher ground, and the environment attacks are just delicioso. Another thing that this game does, which in this case is a good thing, is that it sidetracks from the main story and expands on parts that we would have wanted to see more of, a lot like with Dead Man's Chest. And I'd say its place within the film's narrative kind of makes sense, because the film's narrative doesn't make sense. And as a result, they make for some really fun levels. That would be a lot cooler if they were in the film as well and not.
Baby, lock the door and turn the lights down low.
Great example of this can be found in the demo. Well, that's convenient. The demo starts with the scene of Logan and the gang in a helicopter, just like in the first 10 minutes of the movie, except this one's an aeroplane. But instead of them just landing, the helicopter gets hit by a missile and Logan is launched into the air, free-falling into the title. Oh god, that poor guy. This is how you open an action game. So how do you open an action movie? I'm not sure if it's this. Fun fact, I recently discovered that this kid is young Troye Sivan. Oh my. And I guess with origin stories, you should expect there to be, well, you know, an origin. And with some of these characters, this happens when they're a child. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be getting Oscar caliber acting. But maybe I should give Troye Sivan some slack, as I'm sure the direction he was given was definitely not a good one. And I guess you could say the same for all 2000s child actors, though it still feels a lot like David Harper's dad.
And that's how I got into Juilliard.
But what about an example of a superhero film with okay writing, written by another terrible person like the Black Mold Lady? Oh yeah! Oh boy, another movie franchise associated with not one, but 2 problematic people. And oh great, they're both gay, loving this representation. This movie is an alright remake of the 1978 film with Christopher Reeves. As for Singer's directing, it's completely safe, inoffensive, and does something that Zack Snyder tries and fails to do, which is exploring Superman as a symbol of hope, and most importantly, Jesus Christ. There's even an ending where Superman dies but then comes back a few days later, and it wasn't even Easter Sunday, something that Zack also does, but Since when was Superman Scottish? At least he doesn't as far as we know, so... And I find the Lex Luthor in this film to still be a pretty good adaptation of the character. And I remember at the time thinking that this casting was perfect. And looking back on this now, I still agree with this, because Kevin Spacey is a supervillain in real life. It's a good thing that he mostly plays evil characters, so whenever I do find him in a movie as a villain, I honestly don't find it taking away from my enjoyment too much, as I'm already meant to dislike it. He could chop off his fingerprints and I'd be like, well, that's a pretty Kevin Spacey thing to do. So is Lex Luthor trying to create an entirely new continent using harvested Kryptonian minerals? Yeah, I think Kevin would definitely do that. So anyway, Superman Returns is mostly forgettable and barely has Superman in it. Which would be fine if the supporting characters were any good, which they aren't. So what about the game?
He does exactly what I do, but better.
So Superman has had a pretty rough run with video games. I mean, it's only taken Batman till 2009 to get a good video game. And Superman Returns, the video game, is definitely better than Superman 64. And I'd say for the time, it was pretty good. It was another game I only had the demo of on the 360, but like with the Wolverine game, I feel like you kinda get the gist of what's going on here. Right off the bat, not that one, the flying in this game is pretty fun, and I love the detail that if you hold it for long enough, you eventually break the speed barrier as you get faster. And after flying endlessly upwards to see how far up you can go, it goes as far as the stratosphere. So some pretty ahead of its time flight mechanics. As for the combat, it's fine. Nothing incredibly innovative, though nothing is necessarily done poorly. There are 3 different ranged attacks you can switch between on the D-pad, utilising Cal's Super Breath, Ice Breath, and Laser Eyes, which you can also use in different ways to save people as well. Though I'm not sure if giving a health bar for the city was that much of a good idea, and it kinda makes the whole game feel like an escort mission. But for what it is, this game is reasonably polished, and way better than the movie. But that's not saying much, because Superman's actually in this game. Who developed this anyway? Oh yeah, EA again, back when they finished games and kept studios alive. On top of this, in the Harry Potter series, they even did the Simpsons game where you can turn into Batman. Man, if only there was a game where you could play as Batman that directly ties into an already established cinematic version of the character. Oh, hang on. The Dark Knight for the iOS. No wait, come back! Developed by Gameloft, who I mainly know for their pretty good GTA clones, and others might know from Minions Rush. Honestly, I think this developer's done well to make a name for themselves, making games as early as the iPod Touch. Remember those? Those were the type of things that your posh auntie would own, and now it's just everyone's phone. Anyway, I originally played this on an iPad, and yes, before you say anything, I was an iPad kid. And on this iPad, I was primarily playing this game or killing a lot of cops in Gang Style. Weirdly enough, this game follows a fair amount of the story beats from the movie and has an open world Gotham you can glide around as well as drive around on your Batbike. Keep in mind that this was a few years before Arkham Knight introduced the Batmobile. And similarly to Superman Returns, this game is pretty impressive for the time it came out, especially considering the hardware it was running off. On top of that, it essentially runs like a rough clone of Arkham Asylum, as you have some of its iconic gadgets at your disposal. However, with Batarangs you have a finite supply, which I love as a mechanic, and means that you don't just have an endless supply from your Infinity Belt.
First try.
So using them matters a lot more. Even if its execution isn't the most polished, it copies a lot of the core mechanics from the Arkham games and translates them onto a portable touchscreen device running on a cutting board in a way that makes it fun and, more importantly, PG. Before I'd eventually get Arkham Asylum, I had this game, and it scratched the itch pretty well for a good time. And you could argue that this game has its own identity by being a tie-in of The Dark Knight Rises, and like I said before, it does make an attempt at following the plot of the film, which essentially boils down to Batman fighting a militia that's overtaken Gotham after being in a hole for a few months. Speaking of which, there is a whole level of you getting out of the holes. And then with the open world, you have several enemy hideouts that you can swoop into at any point, which gives you a little sense of accomplishment, as it feels like you're chipping away at Payne's militia rather than it happening mostly off screen. On top of all that, you even get Hans Zimmer's score, or I should say, a score that sounds like Hans Zimmer, which feels so much more immersive in the world of The Dark Knight. Though I wish I could say the same about its voice acting, because this guy is definitely not Morgan Freeman.
In the meantime, I've sent a VR training package your way. You can start it at any moment by accessing your computer. Thanks, Lucius.
And now for a quick word from the sponsor of this video. This video is brought to you by... Just kidding, I don't have one. Another genre that had a lot of tie-in games at the time was... Hello. Future TJ here. So you might have noticed in the Batman section that the audio wasn't very good. Well, in this section, I also didn't realize that I was out of focus the entire time I was recording it. Sorry, what was that? No, I'm not recording it again. So unfortunately, you're just going to have to put up with it looking like this. I apologize, but anyway, let's just get back to the video. Part 3. Animation. And the first game I'd like to talk about is pretty incredible. Written and directed by Edna Mode,
Darling.
The Incredibles was the 6th film in Pixar's 2000s winning streak, centered around a family of superheroes living in an age where being a superhero is illegal. The story focuses on 4 members of this family. I'm not counting Jack Jack because this guy's a baby.
A child. No.
And also the most overpowered one, so probably wouldn't translate well in a video game. And how does the game adapt this? Well, I'm glad you didn't ask. It was developed by Heavy Iron Studios, who also did Rise of the Underminer and Wall-E for the Xbox 360, who made the creative decision to, rather than having them together as a family unit in gameplay, instead separating them into their own levels. And whilst this may be disappointing, I'd say this serves the game pretty well. Originally, I was going to write this section on Fantastic Four, which does use the Party of 4 mechanic, but honestly, I don't have a whole lot to say other than, oh look, you can switch between the characters and levels. Whoa. And needless to say, this was done a whole lot better in Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, which came out only a few years later. Something that I would have been more than happy to see more of was the early sequence of Mummy and Daddy Incredible fighting in the golden age of superheroes. So, I shouldn't say this too loud because it'll become a Disney Plus show before you know it.
Nice.
But guess what? There's 2 whole levels where you get to play as these 2, fighting on the rooftops of the city they'd sworn to protect. And having these characters have whole levels designed around their abilities allows for the player to appreciate more of what they have to offer. Mr. Incredible can pick up and throw things, Elastigirl can swing from poles, wait, that doesn't sound right, Violet has stealth sections, and Dash's levels are basically temple run. Ah shit, I forgot to lock the door again. This game, as far as I can remember, feels a lot like a direct adaptation of the movie, and mostly just expands on scenes that we wouldn't have minded seeing more of. Except for maybe chasing a bus. I already do that a lot in real life, and so I don't really think that makes for a fun game. Similarly to the last game I mentioned, this game features music composed by the great Michael Giacchino, once again enhancing the gameplay experience and making it feel more like an extension of the movie. And I know it looks dated now, but honestly I think the graphics of this game does a pretty good job at mimicking the distinct art style of the film. Though there is another example of this that's aged about as well as a carton of almond milk from Lidl.
Shrek.
Shrek 2 needs no introduction. Developed by Luxaflux, who'd later go on to develop the Kung Fu Panda and Revenge of the Fallen games, only to be shut down by their overlords at Activision, this game can't really compete with the highs and lows of the movie, and I'd say struggles with what to do with its core premise. How does Big Green Ogre struggling with oppression get turned into gameplay?
Hero time!
Like that. Like with the aforementioned Fantastic Four and Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, the gameplay works around a party of 4, each with unique abilities which you can swap between within levels, though half the time, the characters it uses in the levels don't really make a lot of sense when compared to the plot of the movie. Like, why is Gingy here? And who invited Red Riding Hood to a prison break with a wolf who may have eaten her grandma?
What?
There's honestly not a whole lot that I have to say about this game, because when I played this as a kid, after a couple of hours it already started to feel a little bit boring and repetitive. Most of the gameplay is just your regular action-adventure, with some minigames sprinkled in to keep it engaging. And some of the levels are based in areas that we never see in any of the films, almost like the opposite of the better examples I've already talked about. Though, maybe it's just me who feels this way, and maybe I shouldn't have picked this as the film to talk about, because apparently, this game was given the Kids' Choice Award for Favourite Video Game. Then again, that might not be saying much, because it's been given to Minecraft 4 times. You know there are other children's games, right? What I can say that I liked about this game is that it uses the locations we do know from the films pretty well. The Far Far Away level I remember feeling a lot like GTA with Shrek characters, which, saying that out loud, makes me wish that was the full game. The humour I'd say is pretty consistent with the movie, and by humour I mean and I like that the magic mirror is basically the tutorial guy. It's funny to look back on this now, knowing that we are getting yet another Shrek movie. If you are worried about Shrek appearing on every billboard, bus stop, and box of cereal, remember when that was happening 20 years ago? On top of that, there were so many Shrek games. There was Super Shrek Brothers Brawl, Shrek Party, and even my personal favourite, Shrekio Kart. Weirdly enough, I have a lot fonder memories of this game, even if it is an obvious knockoff. And that's just because you get several racetracks in both Far Far Away and Fairy Godmother's Factory. Plus, there's a mechanic where you can whack other drivers as you overtake them, which I found pretty innovative for its time. Another example that can be seen as a knockoff disguised as a tie-in game was the SpongeBob movie for the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, weirdly, this was the version I owned, which I nicked from one of my mates and most definitely forgotten to give back. And even though I never owned a Game Boy Advance, some of the old models of the DS had a built-in Game Boy emulator, which I thought was really cool, and I wish they still did this kind of thing. But oh well, I guess we'll have to wait 5 years for it to be released on the PS5 Pro Enhanced Edition Series P. In the first SpongeBob movie, co-directed by the show's creator, Stephen Hillenburg and Mark Osborne, who would later go on to direct the first Kung Fu Panda movie, the story centers around SpongeBob and his friend Patrick going on a quest to retrieve the lost crown of King Neptune. A simple premise, and yet this film is still, to this day, very funny. I quote it on a regular basis.
Oh, Karen, my computer wife.
Funny that this film is the only one that directly involves Stephen Hillenburg, whilst the others just include his name, like his tombstone. There's one sequence that I still love that involves an ice cream lady, and if you haven't seen this movie, think of it like watching The Thing as a preschooler. I just love how creepy it is for a film that is mostly a comedy. So how about the game? Well, much like a 2D Mario game or any other 2D platformer you'd like to fit under umbrella term, you have an overworld that separates the levels along with a boss fight at the end of each of them. And there are 2 levels dedicated to the area where we beat the ice cream lady, scattered with bones accompanied by a spooky soundtrack, with some of the piles functioning as platforming obstacles that crush you if you're not quick enough. Honestly, I found this whole section to be such a huge highlight, especially with the platforming being somewhat challenging depending on your experience. On top of that, with the playable characters being both SpongeBob and Patrick as a unit, it feels a lot more like a Donkey Kong Country game, especially when comparing the difficulty curve of the platforming along with the surprising amounts of secrets hidden throughout. Some of these you can't even find unless you use the charge ability, which involves SpongeBob pushing Patrick around like his personal battering ram.
Welcome to the Salty Spittoon, how tough are you?
Or even a combination of that and his gliding ability, which is directly taken from the film.
What you doing out here with all this ass? Double cheeked up on a Thursday afternoon.
This version of the game was developed by WayForward, who have had a great deal of success with their Shantae series. I wonder why. Oh, it's because they're fun platformers with plenty of gameplay variety and beautiful sprite work. So I guess it makes sense that this game looks and feels as polished as it does. Now, before I get into the last game I want to talk about in length, there are a few honourable mentions that I wish I could talk more about, but judging by my word count, I have a feeling this video is going to be quite long. So let's do a quick speed round. Peter Jackson's King Kong makes for a surprisingly good first-person action game where you play as Adrian Brody and had some incredible innovations such as no HUD or aiming reticle, being able to set things on fire, and entire sections where you get to swing around as Kong and fight giant monsters. This should come as no surprise though, as it was directed by Michel Ancel, back when Ubisoft used to finish games, who's mainly known as the creator of a little game called Rayman and also directed the first Beyond Good and Evil. The first Avatar movie had a really great 360 game, also developed by Ubisoft, which had you choose between the 2 warring factions of humans and Na'vi depending on in-game choices, with an ambitious open world and several vehicles or animals you can use to get around it. Funny how the newer ones somehow got worse at executing this. It's almost as if they ran out of time to develop this, which I wouldn't know anything about. Star Wars 3, Revenge of the Sith, developed by The Collective, doesn't include its original cast but still managed to get James Arnold Taylor to voice Obi-Wan before the first season of Clone Wars, which is kind of cool. And there's a really fun arena feature where you can play as several of the movie's heroes and villains with their own unique movesets. Plus Darth Vader. My favourite of them all is still General Grievous because 4 is bigger than 1. The Simpsons game, though not at all linked to the events of the film, came out within the same year, which sort of counts, with Springfield as the hub world that can transition you between levels you can run around in as one of the 4 family members, and you can even play as the baby in air vent sequences that switches into the first person. And it was made by Visceral Games, who made Dead Space.
Holy moly.
And finally, Tron Evolution, which is criminally underrated and was made by Propaganda Games, who'd only made the Turok reboot this game and then got shut down before they could make an unreleased Pirates of the Caribbean game. And though it doesn't really follow the plot of Tron Legacy, but more of what happens beforehand, while still utilising characters also seen in the movie, it features some incredible fight mechanics with the iconic light disc, discs, and also an online multiplayer where you can fight in a huge arena that allows you to drive around on a light cycle at the click of a button. Okay. I think I'm done. There are still so many movie tie-in games that deserve recognition, much like with the Tron Evolution game. But there is one I feel perfectly summarizes everything that I've poorly cobbled together in this video. And that game is one that pretty much inspired me to make this in the first place, for its faithful adaptation to the story, with the addition of extra levels that don't feel as tacked on as the others, and even more features that only enhance and extend the incredible experience that makes it so replayable, based on a film that marked the end of a generation and the start of a new one, which for me was the moment I realized that we won't get anything as special and as perfect of an ending as this. So with this game, and with this movie, they really reached for the skies. Toy Story 3, the video game, is one of my favourite video games of all time, based on the film that should have been the last of the series, and what felt like the beginning of the end for tie-in games. Sure, there were plenty others that came out after this, but the number was getting smaller and smaller each year, much like with Pixar and their ability to come up with new ideas. The film, directed by Lee Unkrich, was about our favourite toys coming to terms with the reality of their kid growing up, and struggling to find new ways of being played with again, resulting in them ending up in a daycare which also functioned as a prison for toys that had been neglected. And after escaping this prison, almost getting incinerated at a garbage dump in the process, the toys finally find a new home for themselves to move on, leaving Woody to say this line, which still brings me to tears even today. So long, partner. I'm sure you don't need an explanation as to why Toy Story 3 is the perfect ending. It just upsets me so much that its creators feels like there's already more to say that hasn't already been said. Toy Story 4 is fine, and I'm sure Toy Story 5 will probably be fine too, but both have been made at the expense of an already perfect goodbye. Toy Story 3 was the peak of Pixar, then I would argue that Toy Story 3, the video game, was the peak of movie tie-in games. Why? I'll tell you. To tackle the obstacle of not having enough story content that would translate into good gameplay, the game dives headfirst into action sequences from the perspective of a child's imagination. 3 times, and all of them make sense alongside the events of the film. Remember the cool opening scene where we see the crazy scenarios that young Andy comes up with whilst he plays with his toys? That's a level. What about that one scene when we're introduced to Bonnie playing with her toys? That's a level. And what about the final scene of the film where an older Andy plays with Bonnie and his old toys for the last time? It's a level! Whilst this may not have the same emotional impact of the film, it still works in service of it. It's sad when we're seeing it from Andy's perspective, as his imagination has slowly faded away as he's gotten older. But from Bonnie's, it's a completely new world of possibilities. And the game uses an environment that we get to see in another part of it later on, which, if you know what I'm talking about, is the game's most unique and best feature. There's another level that isn't in the film, but still works as an extension of the Toy Story canon. You want to know what it is? It's the Buzz Lightyear game.
Okay, let's go.
Which includes several gameplay features that are seen in Toy Story 2 that are incredibly utilized. Buzz shooting a crystal with his laser, it's in the game. Buzz running from spikes that would impale him at any point, it's in the game. Buzz jumping on floating platforms that fall down as he jumps on the wrong one, it's in the game. Almost every mechanic you could possibly think of when watching this film has been incredibly utilized. But what about the scenes that do take place in the reality of this film? They're fun too!
The game is fun.
Even the escort mission is good because you're protecting characters that you grew up loving and would hate to see them get obliterated to smithereens. Not a city that has a health bar or the president's annoying daughter. It's Ham, Rex, and Slinky. How about a whole level where you get to run around Andy's room and Tony Hawk grind down banisters into the basement, or a stealth sequence where you're escaping from Sunnyside? they're all here, and I found them so much fun to play, let alone talk about. Just like with the Incredibles game, the graphics only complement the film's distinct style and artwork. I'm so excited about this game that I didn't even realize that I was out of focus the entire time I was talking about it. Oh, buddy, you have no idea.
Anyway,
it honestly feels like this game was thought up by a child who grew up loving these movies. And yet it was made by Avalanche Studios, who would then go on to make, no, we're not talking about it. It's just great. All of it comes together perfectly in the game's sandbox mode, or as the game calls it, toy box mode, which gives you a whole town to build from the ground up with various missions given out by your favorite characters, each earning you in-game currency as you save up for more buildings you can put down and customize that you buy from Owl's Toy Barn. Or even special sets like a machine that produces goo you can use to make things bigger or smaller, as well as full sets that have their own separate levels like a haunted house, magic tree, or another Buzz Lightyear level! Do you see why this is my favourite? There's just so much variety in the gameplay, but none of it feels out of place, and above everything, it makes you feel like a kid again without feeling forced. It's a shame that this game isn't backwards compatible on the PS5 or PS4, and with the industry constantly pushing remakes and remasters of games we've already played, I just wish we could get more of games like this. But the sad reality is that we can't. But that doesn't mean that there is no hope for a brighter future of gaming. For those of you who are still watching this video, thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. I did not realize how long it would take me to record this, because I started in the morning and now it is nighttime. If you fancy it, you could like the video and subscribe for possibly more rambling content in the future. And if there's anything you feel like I'd missed or would like to challenge me on any of my opinions, feel free to drop a comment down below. But please be nice, because I will cry if you're mean. I hope this video was somewhat entertaining and perhaps even enlightening on how these two different creative mediums can complement one another. These worlds that we escape to shouldn't just end when we leave the cinema or our internet cuts out. And for a time, there was a wide selection of games that kept that escapism going. In many ways, they were exactly the kind of cash grabs you'd expect them to be. But in others, they only helped build our appreciation for these worlds and the creativity behind them. Tie-in games aren't exactly dead. They're just something else now. Whilst we shouldn't expect any films accompanied by the dessert option of a video game months later, we can still get licensed games. Over the last few years, we've had some good and even great games based on beloved franchises, such as Alien Isolation, RoboCop Rogue City, or even the underrated Mad Max game. These games aren't exactly extensions of the movies they're based on, but they are still passionately made by people who care, even if they are in the minority. With the oversaturation of movie franchises and the constant digging up of old blockbusters for newer audiences, it's funny how they rarely seem to capitalize on exploring these same stories in newer ways. Sure, I don't mind seeing it again, but what if I got to play it this time? What new possibilities of storytelling could there be within this medium that the industry consistently neglects? We don't need a game that's over 40 hours to complete. Nor do we need sequels that answer the same questions we've already had answered. What we do need is a fresh perspective. And we always will. I just want to give a huge shout out to my buddy Adam from Thorn on Film. If it weren't for him, I'd probably still be editing this video right now. In the time it's taken me to make this, he's started a channel, made several videos, and all of them are very good, so I highly recommend you check out his channel. Thanks again, and TJ out.